Hi neighbors, this is Haiti Penamino, your host for Social Practices in the House of Wisdom, a podcast for the citizens of Red Deer to help us connect to each other, learn new practices, and revive some older practices that should probably still be in circulation. Our guests today are Bonnie McCrae and Sharon Crooks. They are going to introduce themselves, and I promise you it's going to be a very exciting episode. So, ladies,
go ahead. Oh, okay. So my name is Bonnie McCrae. I came to Red Deer about 30 years ago. At the age of 15, I decided that I didn't want to be in a church any longer. It just kind of wasn't fitting with me. So I sought out alternatives, and it's been quite the journey since now I'm 68. So that was 53 years ago. So I've come through a number of different spiritualities and different paths, and I finally landed on Druidry, which I find fulfilling. I live a life of service. In my mundane life, I own a business and have done so for many, many years. I do cleaning and maintenance for property managers, so life can be challenging, but it's a good life.
And my name is Sharon Crooks, and I'm a lawyer actually in my mundane life, although I'm non-practicing anymore. I do trauma-informed mediation arbitration still. I'm well past retirement age, but I like to work, and that's what I'm doing. And with respect to spirituality, I knew at about 13 or 14 that I was pagan, that the traditional religions were not for me. And so like Bonnie, it's been an interesting journey, and it's been, I don't know, 25 years maybe since I knew that Druidry was the right path for me, in particular Celtic Druidry, and that's what Bonnie and I do, and we would be considered elders in our community.
Mm-hmm. Now, it was roughly, 1972, when it was still kind of illegal to practice any kind of religion. How do you feel that has affected our society?
Well, I think it was witchcraft that was in particular. There were still some things on the books about that, but that's when some of the people out of the States started writing, and the books were available up here.
Can you tell me a little bit more about paganism and the origins and things like that?
Well, pagan actually is a word that means people of the country. It doesn't really have any negative connotations, and it was created at the time that Christianity was being created 2,000 years ago, and Christianity was spread within the cities because they could reach more people much faster, but the people out in the outlying areas out in the country didn't get exposed to Christianity, so they remained with the traditional practices of the people in whatever particular land that they came from.
And at its heart, paganism is polytheistic, and the closest, what I would call traditional religion, is probably Hinduism in with the people from India, and because they have sort of many gods and goddesses, and there's lots of varieties, of paganism, and even within the Wiccan, or witchcraft, and with Druids as well, right? Everybody has, sort of their own idea, and that's one of the really nice things about it, is that you don't necessarily tell people what they have to believe. You find a place that works for you, and our group is fairly eclectic. While Bonnie and I and some of the other core members are Druids, there are other people that are Wiccans or witches, and we're pretty open. If we're doing rituals, Bonnie and I, they're Druidic focused, and if some of the other people are doing it, maybe they're a little more Wiccan or focused on witchcraft. So
can you tell me a little bit more about your group? What's it called?
It's called the Grove of the Ancient Ways.
That's beautiful.
And we actually took a great deal of time to come to that. We had been involved in some other groups prior, and that's actually how Sharon and I met, was in another group. And we just felt that group wasn't fitting what we wanted to do, so we went off on our own with some of the other people that were in that group, and we got a little more focused on what it was that we feel is right for us. So.
Okay. Why is it important to have this type of teaching?
I think it's important for people to have be part of a community so that they belong somewhere. They feel like they belong. In this society right now, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of loneliness and disconnection, and with all of the social media stuff that keeps people focused. I think that people need something and a reason to go out and join something and be part of something and feel like they belong. And it's a community where people are very accepting. Whatever, if people need help and there's a way we can help within the community, we do, whether that's sort of informal counseling or sometimes financial.
And sometimes just somebody to hold your hand and let you cry because life isn't great, right? So, it's open. It's very open like that. So, and we being elders, we pretty much make ourselves available to anyone within our own community, that if you have a particular problem or you just need somebody to vent to, we're here.
And if we can't deal with it, between the two of us, we have pretty broad
life experience.
Yeah, and would know for the most part where to direct someone. And being a lawyer, and I'm doing in the last, out of the 36 years I practiced, I think the last 24 were primarily in family, children, and related issues. So I have a lot of connections if people, need help or something like that.
So I'm curious, this might be a little bit more of a controversial question, whereas traditional religion, where you're in a church and you're following a certain curriculum, how that differs in this type of setting where you are essentially learning about all the religions and all the gods. How do you feel like that influences a person's capacity to explore their beliefs?
Well, I think the main difference between traditional religion and what we do is there's no in-between person. We go directly to our own gods, right? We don't have a minister in between who needs to, take up our cause for us. We don't go direct.
We don't need an intermediary.
No, we do not. So, and another interesting thing is we don't actually, how can I put this? We don't actually pray or bend a knee, right? Because our gods are our ancestors, if that makes sense. So our spiritual path is based on ancestral as opposed to creational, which makes a big difference, right? So when I'm talking to an ancestor, and I might call him a god or I might call her a goddess, I go direct, right? And I don't bend knee, I negotiate. Okay, I negotiate, and I don't always say, if I said, I need money, give me money, I would say, open the way for me to find the path that I can make the money, because I'm not afraid to work for it. I don't need to be given it. I just need to know the path and the direction that I need to go.
Right.
Okay?
And I think it's nice that people will find things that interest them more, or gods or goddesses that speak to them more than others. And while Bonnie and I aren't experts on all of them, we are familiar with a lot, certainly in the Celtic pantheon. And you can direct people in terms of doing their own study, things like that. I think.
Well, we actually prefer that.
Yeah.
Right. Frequently, if we're going to be doing, I'll call it a rite, and we're going to use particular gods or particular goddesses, we will make that known. And we actually request that the people who will be attending do their own research, know why we're using them. Because part of what we do too is we base ourselves on what we call the wheel of the year, just like many of the other pagan religions or spiritual paths do. But it's actually based in agrarian, which means we're always looking at the cycle of the year, right? So right now, right, we've just finished passing a ritual called Lunasa. And Lunasa celebrates the land, as we mostly do, but in this particular case, it's about the first harvest. And the first harvest is usually about wheat, grains, those things that are now being taken off the fields. So we will bring bread into the rite, because that's part of what is going on culturally, annually, right? So the next one, we called Mabon, will be about other things. Right, further into the year, we call it the second harvest, right? And then there's the third harvest, which we call Samhain. And it is on Halloween, Samhain is not scary like Halloween. It's all about our ancestors and giving thanks, right? And you may call it the dark time. And the only reason we call it the dark time, it's not because we don't believe in dark and light or good and evil. It's dark because we don't get as much sunlight.
Because it's winter.
It is winter. So, and it's kind of the celebration of the end of all that work for all those harvests. And now we're going into the time of year where we spend time with family and we tell stories. And by the time we get to Yule, which is the winter solstice, right? That is really what we're starting to celebrate, is the time we now get to spend, after we've done the harvest and the canning and the preserving and I'm afraid the animals need to be culled, right? Mm-hmm. So none of it's bad. It's just life, old way life, right? So, if you lived on a farm, this is all the things you would do. We just celebrate it.
The interesting thing is some of the rituals and some of the things we celebrate have a real solid base in, in the Celtic history. So, for example, Bonnie was talking about Lunasa that we just celebrated, and the god and goddess that we celebrated were Lu, who is a sun god, and Taltu, who's a very old mother goddess. And the interesting thing is that, there's lots of legends around her and stuff, but when she died, they attributed, her making the land of Ireland fit to grow crops and things on.
Terrible.
Yeah, and so when people were wanting to celebrate, or to maybe, I guess, mourn her, not celebrate, she said she didn't want them to mourn, she wanted them to celebrate, and she wanted them to have games and feasts and stuff. And so they were sort of one of the first precursors, it was so long ago, to very much like the Olympic Games. And there's still a place in Ireland, a hill called Telltown, where they had the fires on Lunasa and celebrated her passing. So it's pretty interesting when you can tie it back to actual places in the old countries.
Now, speaking of social practices, that would be something really worthwhile reviving versus commemorating the, date of somebody's death. You could celebrate when you're together during Yule, their life, and say, hey, let's sort to a grandmother, here's a drink. You know what I mean? Like,
we do that at Samhain.
Yeah,
that's exactly what we do at Samhain.
You set a plate for your ancestors.
Absolutely. We have a feast that we share with our ancestors on Samhain.
Mm-hmm. That's very wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay. So speaking about the ancestors and giving them, recognition, can you tell me more about the Druidry? Is that what you would call it?
Druidry, yeah. I don't know, how do we explain Druidry?
As a Druid, you celebrate the gods, which includes the goddesses, the dead, which are your ancestors, and the she, which are the spirits of the land, the spirits around you. So it's really tripartite, gods, ancestors, and the she. And so we give honor to the spirits of the land where we reside. We honor the ancestors always, and whatever gods and goddesses appeal to us. The interesting thing about a polytheistic spirituality is that it's very openly accepting of different people, different personalities, things like that. I always think of all spirituality and religion kind of like this really large, multifaceted gem, and people choose a religion or a spirituality based on which facet or face of that gem appeals to them. I think it's probably part of some kind of bigger, whole, consciousness, if you like. But being a pagan and being, polytheistic allows, without any controversy to pick, to oath. Some people oath. They give an oath that they're going to follow the path of this goddess or that god, and they do that. They dedicate themselves to their service. And different gods and goddesses have different attributes in terms of, what they bring to the table.
Mm-hmm. One of the gods that I've dedicated to is Lu, the fellow we just basically had Lunasa with. And the reason that I do is because one of his names is Simuldanach. Now, Simuldanach means multi-talented, multi-skilled, right? So in my lifetime, I have been many, 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 many things, right? So my skill set is very wide, so I really relate to him. I consider myself to be a Simuldanach, So I just feel closer to him than some of the other gods. So I serve him.
So I enjoy the concept of being able to choose, because you say you're closer to one, deity
Yes, a deity.
than others, for example. Whereas, when we're traditionally taught to believe, we're stuck on the one thing.
Right.
And if we feel that one is not pleased with us, it's just like, oh, then we kind of feel like we're in the doghouse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of nice to be able to go, so and so's not talking to me. Maybe I go over here, and so I don't know if that's how it works, but in my head I'm thinking, oh.
Well,
But it allows you to choose. It's not so much about someone feeling that, or you feeling someone that doesn't approve of you. Depending on who you are and what your personality is and what your interests are, you can be drawn to many different gods or goddesses, and one is not bad or good. It's that there are different aspects of your personality and different aspects of your life, and sometimes at different times of your life you're drawn to different kinds of energy, and that's really what it is different kinds of energy, and not being limited. I'm a lawyer, litigator for 36 years, don't much like being told what to do, and can be, given the right provocation, a tad combative. So the goddess that I'm oath to represents that, the Morrigan.
and I am also
Yes,
oath to the Morrigan.
Yeah,
She's a
both
battle goddess. She's a battle warrior.
Mother Goddess.
Mother
warrior
goddess as well,
Yeah.
right? So she represents many things. So it's not as if every single god or goddess is a one-hit wonder. They're not, right? So the Morrigan is warrior, mother, grandmother. What else? She's just a million things, truly.
Goddess of sovereignty, dreams, the other world, spirits, death,
Well,
and rebirth.
and rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's just really interesting, right? Like everybody isn't a single being. We're multiple beings inside of ourselves, right? So having a god or a goddess that is also multifaceted like that fits better.
That is a very interesting thing you just said, because my previous guest, Skylar Reneseth, talked about his online life and how he's multiple people online. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you just said?
Oh, well, how can I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I just think that there are different energies that you bring to the table in different facets of your life. And there's nothing wrong with having someone to represent that. There are people that are oathed to more than one god or goddess, right?
And I also think that through the different, so when I said that I kind of realized at the age of about 15 that traditional religion just sort of wasn't for me, the gods and the goddesses I was looking at then and was interested in then have changed because I've changed. I'm older, I'm more mature, and I'm more settled into who I truly am. And I think I've kindly landed, if that makes any sense, right? And I think that's also important. It's you're different people at different times of your life, right?
Yeah.
Especially, I think for women that have had kids, right? You're a young person and you're an individual, and then you're a mother, often part of a family, but not always. But when you have children, that's a different phase of your life, right? And while you're raising your children and working and whatever you're doing, and then when your children go, that's another phase of your life. And as you get older, I'm in my 70s, and so I have grandchildren and hopefully great-grandchildren before too long. And it's a very different phase of life. I was listening to something recently that talked about the grandmother hypothesis, and that hypothesis is that in most species, including humans, the females do not live long after their period of fertility when they can have children. And there are 3 primary species that have quite long life after they cease to be, or after they pass their reproductive years. And one is humans, and elephants also live quite a ways past the time when they are fertile, and whales, orcas, sperm whales, pretty much the toothed whales and the orcas, and they live a long time. And the theory, if you're looking at the grandmother hypothesis, is that the females lose their reproductive ability but stay alive to care for and teach the younger generations, right? To pass on their knowledge. And, there are other, social scientists that have different ideas about it. But I kind of like the idea of that. It makes sense from, what I know of elephants, what I know of the, whales and orcas. They're matrilineal. Mm-hmm. Certainly, elephants are, there's frequently, a matriarch that leads them. And the same, orcas, they have groups sometimes, with a lot of clans sort of that connect, and it's matrilineally, and with some of the other whales. And so it's interesting because, very early on, before the patriarchy took hold, it was all matrilineal, right? And that's how we existed.
Well, there's still groups of human beings where it's still matrilineal. Yeah. And the women are the leaders of those particular cultures.
And in some indigenous tribes, that's what it was like here before, colonialism came in and sort of co-opted, who they were. And that sort of confused things, I think, for them, and it's made it more difficult. Although there are still some tribes that are matrilineal, and that's how property and everything passes. They're the ones that sort of run things. So it's interesting when you look at it, not just within our species, but within other species in terms of, how evolution affects us.
That's true. I was thinking as well, too, as you're talking about Indigenous culture, how interesting it is that millions of miles away, a very similar culture in its way of passing down information and transitioning to generation would be almost the same.
There's a lot of similarity between, some of the ways Indigenous people practice their spirituality and how, the Celts did, And I think that it's, at its most basic, the Indigenous people were organized in tribes. Well, so were the Celts. They were organized in tribes. And I think that...
They just called them clans.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in Scotland they call them clans.
Yes.
Probably tribes in some of the other places. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I think it's interesting, and if you're open to looking at something without having a preconceived notion about what it is, it's interesting because you often see similarities that that you might not have expected going in. And so being in an Indigenous ritual, I feel quite comfortable because it's very similar to some of the stuff we do. Not identical, but very similar. And I think that there are Indigenous people that, attend rituals sometimes, or our rites, and they're quite comfortable because it's familiar in a sense, that sort of tribal context. Yeah.
We honor the land, we honor the ancestors, right? So that's very similar.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to share about some misconceptions that we might have in our belief system when it comes to rituals, rites, and paganism?
I think the biggest thing that the questions I get asked is if you're doing, spells, people think that they are something that is negative, wicked, whatever. And the interesting thing is, a spell is a prayer by another name. Mm-hmm. That's all you're doing is you're gathering the kind of energy and you're asking for some result or some assistance for a result that you want. The thing is that, when you believe in a, religion that is as, I think there are karmic aspects to it as well. You don't want things to come back on you, right? And in lots of pagan religions, they will say that what you put out, will come back 3 times 3, right? And so when you're putting out really negative energy, there's every chance there's going to be some kind of backlash. So you don't do that. You can, say what you want. You could bless someone to be really happy far away from you if that person is hurtful to you, or if they're
be happy over there.
Yeah, well, yeah,
over there.
Yeah,
yes.
Be very happy, but do it, away from me, so then I'll be safe, right?
Yes.
Or things like the Wiccans, the Wiccan Rede says, "An ye harm none, do as you will." Druids were not exactly like that because they were battle druids that were involved in the wars. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, it's sort of common sense. When I do stuff, I would often say, with harm to none and justice for all. Maybe some of the background in terms of my, my mundane profession, I guess, maybe. But I think that's true, and you sort of put that energy out to the universe, and this is what I'm thinking, but you do with it what you will and what's just, right? because we see things from a very narrow perspective often. And I've heard lots of people that are supposedly very religious in some traditional religions ask their God to do some very nasty things to people, which I would never do, because I would be concerned that that would come back and bite me in the ass.
Truly.
Well, I think that, it's part of what I do is sort of in terms of my trauma-informed practice. We don't have the right to judge people. We have the right to respond to certain behaviors, whether it's, spoken or physical behavior. I have every right to respond to someone's behavior, but I have no right to judge them. I don't know what trauma they've experienced. I don't know what they've come from. And when you judge people, people automatically, get defensive and react negatively. But when you are accepting of them as a person, but you will limit your interaction because of their actions or their words, they understand in a better way. And I think that you get a better result when people are clear that you're not judging them, just their behavior, right? Because you get to determine what behavior and what energy you bring into your life. And
we're allowed to put up boundaries.
Yeah.
Right? Just like anyone, right? So sometimes you have to draw clearer lines for people.
Right.
Right?
So with social practices, what we're aiming to achieve is having a place where people can go and be a part of community.
Yes.
Having a place where they can go and feel that they're respected, like we just talked about, that they're not being judged, and that they're, in a sense, living a life of service.
Right.
Would you be able to tell me a little bit more about what it would look like to be involved in, let's say, a ritual that you're hosting?
Well, a life of service for me, and I've tried to live a life of service, and that basically means that I've always allowed myself to be available, right, for anyone who needs anything. And that can either be, a little loan to make sure you've got food or food itself. Just basically giving of my time and my resources as I can. And when we get to ritual, it takes hours and hours and more hours just to write them, right? Because we want to make sure that, number one, they're inclusive, that people understand what it is that we're doing. We certainly don't want people to come to a ritual, a new person coming, and be scared about anything. We're pretty clear on what it is that we do. So Sharon and I give a lot, and we've been giving a lot for many, many years, right? And that's how you build an organization like we've got, like our little grove. We were, for many years, it was just me and Sharon. And then we reconnected with some other people, and then there were 5, and then we opened our doors to more. And now there's about 20.
Give or take, yeah.
Give or take.
And, in an ideal world, we would probably be doing more classes and stuff like that, but we're both still really busy. I'm still, I have another company after I stopped, went non-practicing as a lawyer, but I have another company where, in effect, I do mediation arbitration, and that keeps me pretty busy. So we do some teaching, but not as much as I would like. And I think we both did things in our sort of mundane lives that were the same way. As a lawyer, you can be on boards and stuff and give back that way. I represented children for many, many years, and lots of times, children whose families were in conflict with child welfare. And so you're working for the government at a rate that was less than a quarter of my hourly rate, but I did it because children need to have, strong advocates and people with experience. And so that was another one of the ways that I gave back, right?
Some questions that have kind of surfaced are pagans devil worshippers?
No, he's Christian.
Yeah. Oh. The devil is a Christian construct. There's no such thing as the devil in paganism. He's when people are upset. If you talk to some Christians that are very Christian and they do believe that, I always say, excuse me, but he's yours, not mine, not in our pantheon at all.
At all.
And, when I'm not going to hell, that's not a concept either. I'm going to Tirnanog, the land of the ever young, in the West.
Absolutely.
Druids. I've heard that they were people who fought for human rights.
I don't know if they fought so much for human rights
I think that, well, in many of the tribes, because once again, this is tribal, so human rights in one tribe might not be what is in another tribe, but the Druids were the law keepers and lawgivers. They often advised the leaders of the tribes or kings of the country. There were different kinds of Druids. Some of the Druids were bards, and they, sang and composed poetry and were involved in the arts and led the community in that way. And so there were different kinds of Druids in different levels. And in Celtic times, lots of times it was like, 20 years of study to be certain kinds of Druids. And so,
And it was all oral.
yeah, not
Nothing
much
was
was
written down. And the reason it wasn't written down is because they firmly believed that once you write something down, it dies. It can't grow anymore.
Yeah, and any system that doesn't have room to grow will become obsolete or extinct.
And I think that that's something that has kind of been slipping away from us, is this oral tradition, which is why I feel that through a podcast that is kind of like a living document, it keeps going, that we can surface some of these topics and keep them alive through the tradition of passing words down into our generations.
Yes.
I think the interesting thing about meeting in circles is that, from my perspective, and not everybody shares it, but from my perspective, it is not, even though I might have written ritual or I might be leading ritual, it's not power over, it's power with. And they're very different concepts because, it's a very large generalization, but the patriarchy often looks at things as power over, not power with, and relationships are transactional. And in our group, relationships are not transactional, they're relational. And a lot of women, that's how women relate to each other. So, for example, if you had a male that was a single parent and he got sick, he might have one of his buddies stop and drop medication or, soup off or something. But if I, when I was younger, if I was sick and I phoned one of my girlfriends, they would have come over maybe with some of my other girlfriends, and they would have made sure I was well and got me medication and fed my kids and cleaned my house and put food in the freezer for the next week. That's a very different relationship. It's one of the reasons as women age, they tend to form groups, right? They have more time, they form groups, and often are looking to see what they can do to help other people. And I think it's unfortunate because sometimes men are so tied into the patriarchal rules that it's almost like they're not given permission to form those kinds of close relationships other than with family. And, that's a very big generalization, and lots of different cultural groups are much healthier than sort of, I'm coming from a, primarily white background. And I think it's something that's been lost, and it's really sad.
Well, I want to thank you so much for the time that you've given me today, and for sharing these amazing, beautiful, cultural, pieces of gold. They're just nuggets of education. I really feel that people are looking for this type of education, especially when we're learning to gather our strength from within, right? And I really feel that you can't really get strong inside if you don't have the proper tools for you on the outside.
Well, community is super important.
Yeah, I think the things for lots of people is, you want to, feel a sense of belonging, you want to feel loved, and I think you want to feel that you're enough exactly as you are.
Yes, yes.
Well, thank you once again, and I just hope that you continue to share these things, and that your what did you call it, a grove, continues to flourish and to grow. So
thank you.
Thanks for having us and asking the questions.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so very much.